we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week.
Trump blockades a blockade. The world holds its breath. Will the Iranians blockade of the blockade? Are we destined for battleship Tetris piling up in the Gulf? Or is this just one more instance of the real war being the PR war?
Then, with his Fidesz party reduced to a rump, what happens when the lynchpin of anti-Brussels energy falls out? The EU threw everything at Orbán, and it has paid off handsomely.
Ursula von der Leyen clearly had her speech about moving to qualified majority voting written before the polls closed. Beyond a cost of living election in a landlocked medium-sized country, this is a story about the future of the EU. Apres Viktor, le deluge.
But first,
new Kid on the Blockade.
Talks between Iran and the United States in Islamabad, Pakistan, broke down over the weekend, and shortly thereafter, Donald Trump announced on Truth Social that he was ordering the United States Navy, the finest navy in the world, he said, to enact a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. He argued that if Western allies were going to, or US allies were going to be prevented getting oil out of the strait, then Iran's friends weren't going to get any oil out either. So we've now got a blockade of a blockade, a counter-blockade, if you like. And that's the situation that we're in at the moment. I would say this, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for the very simple reason that Iran has greater pain tolerance. The balance of resolve in this war is very heavily in favor of Iran. Iran has far greater resolve and thus far greater pain tolerance. And the reason for that is because for Iran, this war is existential. The survival of the governing system within Iran itself is at stake. The United States and Israel, the two belligerents in the war against Iran, have made very clear that they are seeking regime change. And that is the outright collapse of the Islamic revolution in Iran. And of course, in this situation, those individuals who run that governing regime, that system, and also the foot soldiers within it who have relied upon it for their careers and don't wish to be strung up on lampposts, as often happens when revolutions are swept aside in this way, are going to fight very hard for it. But I think it's even more than that I think it's well understood that a second best option, certainly for Israel, would be something like the Yinon plan of state dissolution into warring ethnic enclaves and statelets. And obviously, when your entire country and certainly your governing regime is at stake, then what's left to lose? You know, like the worst that you have to tolerate is still going to be less than that in your mind. So, of course, the balance of resolve is very heavily weighted in favor of Iran. That means that they can tolerate far more pain than either the US or Israel in this war. And that is specifically why they chose to fight a counter-value war rather than a counter-force war. What do I mean by that? Well, in nuclear war fighting theory, there are two kinds of nuclear attacks. There's counter-force attacks, which are essentially attacks on the opposition armed forces and command and control centers. And then there are counter-value attacks, which are attacks on the state itself and the ability of the state to continue functioning. Now, if we apply those two to this war, we will see that Iran attempted to switch the main type of battle from a counter-force war, i.e. attacks against the Iranian command and control and individual military assets and infrastructure, and toward a counter-value war in which it attempted to inflict economic pain on the US to force the US to stop. And I think it's been quite successful in that so far. But the key here is that it chose to do that. And the primary means it chose to do that was by cutting off the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, it was saying to the world that it was going to sanction the world until the world stopped the US and Israel doing what they were doing. In the same way that we sanctioned Russia until they stopped attacking Ukraine, or we might have sanctioned Iraq in the 1990s until they treated their people better, or the US sanctions Cuba. Iran was saying, look, we're going to sanction planet Earth here, and it's a very blunt tool, but sanctions always are. And we are just going to inflict economic pain until you squeal stop. So now Donald Trump is effectively doing this for them. He has entered the field of battle that they have chosen. And because the balance of resolve is so heavily in their favor, that, of course, is not going to work.
Yeah, I don't know much to say about the blockade on the blockade. It's just absurd, and I don't know what else to say about it. But more generally, what's going on at the moment, at least how it seems to be shaping up, if you following the news reports. First thing to note is that the Americans seem to be bringing in a lot more material and maybe equipment. I saw multiple reports of them sending those large, is it C-130 aircraft, to bring in presumably more munitions and so on. I think these are probably some of the remaining standoff munitions. They're just gonna burn through them, I guess, as Trump does this thing on Truth Social. Strange thing to do, but apparently they are. And you see other reports of them bringing in 2,500 Marines and stuff. And it makes me wonder whether they're going to try something there. If you read it in that way, the blockade squared, or whatever they want to call it, is just to keep the momentum going, when Churchill had the bombing campaign, and after the defeat at Dunkirk, they just kind of kept, it was a completely pointless bombing campaign, loads of people died, and they just kept it going because they needed to keep the momentum of the war going so that they could eventually pull the Americans in. So this is kind of you could read it as a shorter version of that. The other possibility is they actually are going to fight naval war against a country that doesn't really have a navy. I mean, a small navy, but really they have missiles. And I don't think that would be a particularly good idea, but we'll see. I think first of all, related to it, or what you were talking about, the sanctions, the oil crisis is starting to bite in Europe. I mean, we all know it in terms of the prices and so on. People can see the price of gasoline going up at the pump much quicker than it's going up in the futures markets, the broken, ridiculous future markets that we should just shut down at this point. But oil shortages, fuel shortages are starting, and they're starting in Ireland. I think I said at the beginning of this that the most vulnerable country in Europe is Ireland. The two most vulnerable countries are Ireland and Britain, and you can probably tell why. They're islands, and so when seaborne oil and gas is interrupted, it hits the islands first, obviously. And Ireland is even more vulnerable than Britain because Ireland's energy supply is managed through Britain, you might say. I don't know all the technical details, but basically Britain imports energy and Ireland imports energy from Britain. So Ireland is going to be the first hit in Europe. It's the westernmost point. It kind of works geographically. And I've been saying these fuel shortages are going to spread east over time. And basically the current reporting is that as of Saturday, 1/3 of fuel stations, petrol stations, gas stations, call them what you will, in Ireland don't have fuel. 1/3 don't have fuel. And I've texted friends and family there. Yeah, they say the shortages are worse in the rural areas than in the suburban and urban areas. But I've been told by friends and family, oh yeah, you go to a petrol station and you don't know if you're going to get fuel or not. You're either going to get access to fuel or there's going to be a sticker saying no fuel, sorry. So, those shortages are coming everywhere. Ireland isn't more reliant on that oil than the rest of Europe. It's just that, it flows through quicker into Ireland. It's already provoking protests. There's enormous protests. The government's trying to flip the script and blame the protesters for the shortages. It's really a wild thing to try and do. But I saw a poll recently, and it was over 60% of Irish people supported the protests. People need to understand, Irish people aren't really into protesting. Protests in Ireland are usually not popular. Like anti-immigration protests, for example, have a lot of support, mainly among people directly impacted by migration. But, overall public support for those types of things is 25% maybe, 20, 25, maybe 30. To have kind of 60% support for a protest that the government is blaming the fuel shortages on and clearly not convincing anybody of that, is pretty shocking. So pay attention to what's happening in Ireland, because it's kind of a 2 to 3 week fast forward of what's going to happen in the rest of Europe. The final thing that I'd note about the war in general that's worth highlighting is that while Donald Trump seems to be trying to distract everyone with these like meta blockades, 4-dimensional blockades, the Israelis have gotten themselves into a real pickle. I saw today they're starting to like ramp up bellicose rhetoric against Turkey to the extent that Erdogan has said, like, if Israel want a war, we'll invade Israel, which they could do, by the way. Can we just step back and realize that Turkey would be perfectly capable of doing that? But why are Israel doing this? I think they're distracting from the fact that they're getting beat up in Lebanon. I mean, it's always hard to tell how a war is going, especially a war that isn't really about territory. Well, the war in Lebanon is about territory, but there doesn't seem to be much movement, let's just say. But, if you follow the kind of like OSINT accounts or whatever, like Hezbollah are active, let's just put it that way. I mean, you can just log on and see tanks being blown up left, right, and center. Really feels like they're taking a beating. And the Israeli domestic press is saying, we need more people, it's demoralized, et cetera, et cetera. I think the US-Israeli coalition, which I guess is kind of what it is, in this multi-front war in the Middle East, it's really not going well. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that it's going to come to an end. The peace talks just don't seem to be going anywhere. I saw that there are more scheduled for later this week, but I wouldn't put much stock in them. And, the oil crisis is coming. It's creeping. It's creeping across Western Ireland, up to Dublin, and it'll creep further east.
Yeah, I don't think that people realize the scale of oil crisis that's coming in our direction. We assume that it's going to mean higher prices in the same way that oil crises did in the past, but there's going to be outright shortages until demand destruction takes care of that. And when I say demand destruction, I mean an extreme and extremely painful reduction in the demand of oil. What does that mean? It means a large number of factories being shut down, and it means a large number of journeys that simply aren't made. But I would add to that people at the moment assume, when I say people, I actually mean a large number even of the elite, but I think most of the average Joe on the street assumes that because this is about oil not getting through and gas not getting through the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to be an energy crisis. And what that's going to mean for them is much higher prices at the petrol station or at the gas station, as our American listeners might say. It'll probably mean higher heating and electricity bills. But that's pretty much it. No, this is not going to be limited to the energy sector. In fact, it's going to ripple through a whole range of sectors within the economy. I think the best known of these additional sectors is the fertilizers section, which relies on direct supplies from the Gulf region, and also on feedstock from the Gulf region. So that ultimately is going to lead to more expensive food. And that's already going to be the case now. I think I'm right in saying that North America planted its lowest acreage in wheat in about 100 years this year. And it was simply because fertilizer prices were too expensive. There's no way to replant that area. Even if prices of fertilizers went down tomorrow, it's too late. The window for sowing these seeds has already passed. The window for then applying the fertilizer has passed. That's going to bake in higher food prices 6 months or a year hence. And that's going to be across the world. It's not just going to be North America. It's going to be Europe. It's going to be Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India. It's going to be everywhere. And that's going to lead to much higher food prices. Then you've got the metals industry, for instance. Extracting copper and cobalt and other metals involves really heavy use of sulfuric acid. That itself comes from sulfur, part of which comes from heavy Middle Eastern oil or directly from the Middle East itself. Metals will therefore get more expensive. Aluminium, I think, is involved as well. Then you move into the clothing sector. A lot of the clothing sector uses artificial materials, which are made, you've guessed it, from petrochemicals. So a large portion, if this continues, a large portion of the clothing manufacture industry will just become non-viable. You know, places like Bangladesh, which are tremendously important in the clothing manufacture industry around the world, a lot of them will just become non-viable. So, all of these shops that are selling, nylon tracksuits and jogging pants and all the rest of it and Nike trainers, the prices of those will just rocket up. So it's going to be clothing prices as well that'll increase. Medical packaging relies on plastics, which come from petrochemicals. Semiconductors rely on helium and other inert gases which come from the Strait of Hormuz, and that of course has a direct impact on the stock market. I mean, we can go on and on, but what we're getting, Philip, is you're seeing the impact of multiple crises in multiple sectors. And while oil and energy will hit first and fertilizers will hit with a delay and the metal sector will hit with another delay and so on and so forth, eventually they're all going to be present in the economy at the same time. And I think for that reason, people simply have not apprehended the scale of the danger that we're facing here. I mean, the risk is that we see something much closer to the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939 than the global financial crisis of 2008, bad as that was. That's the danger here. And that isn't something that is caused by a normal run of economic advent, like a freak economic wave. It's caused by a breakdown in the very nature of the global economic system itself. It's the fact that there are some nodes within this highly globalized, highly optimized for efficiency, and therefore highly fragile global economic system, a global economic network. The problem is that some nodes on that are so crucial that damaging them or breaking them makes the whole system break. And governments are going to come to that conclusion. If this really gets to the kind of serious crisis that I think it could get to if we do not get oil flowing through the strait very, very soon indeed, like within a month or so, then what's going to happen is governments are going to look and say, well, hang on a sec. It's not just the fact that our economies are now broken and we're facing multiple crises in energy, food, clothing, plastics, metals, all at once. It's not that. It's the system itself that's created this. And therefore, in this super high-pressured environment where you get social unrest, as you're already starting to see in Ireland, where you're going to see very big reductions in the standard of living, where you're going to see massive joblessness, in that sort of environment, they'll start a panic rewiring of the global economic system, a rewiring of post-war civilization itself. And that starts to get really very serious indeed, I think. And that's the big risk here. And it's far bigger than an energy crisis like the 70s. I mean, what we're dealing with is much bigger than that. Hello there, Andy Collingwood here with a public service announcement. Please pay attention. It's important to listen to this if you are already a subscriber of Multipolarity, the podcast. I'm here to tell you that we are going to be using Substack to put out the premium episodes of the podcast. You might already know that we have a Substack and we have been growing it. It features the weekly Multipolarity brief written by me, which provides deep analysis of the important geopolitical events of the week and gets really very good feedback indeed. We've run into a small issue here, though, in that lately, one or two people have been signing up on Substack with the intent of getting the premium episodes of the podcast, which so far have been exclusive to Patreon. So what we've decided to do is to take the premium podcast to Substack as well, and to bundle it with a new range of articles that we're in the process of producing. The deal is going to be this. The Substack will be $12 a month, and that will get you the premium podcast, the normal episodes of the podcast, and various paywalled articles on top of that. Now, we're not going to paywall the written side of Substack as yet. We've actually got very big plans for Substack. Really cool plans, actually. I'm very excited. Philip is kind of buzzing in the background about these. And eventually we're going to have to paywall that because it is going to be a lot of work and it's going to add a lot of value to our readers. So it's going to be worth the paywall. But for now, we're not going to paywall the written stuff. But we will paywall the premium episodes of the podcast on the Substack. And as I said, ultimately, the Substack is going to be much bigger and much cooler, and you're going to want to subscribe. Of course, if you're an existing subscriber now, you can do whatever you like, Patreon or Substack. One gives you the pod only, that's Patreon. The other will give you the premium pod, as well as the written work eventually. Obviously, your price won't change if you're an existing subscriber, unless you change platforms. So, if you are an existing subscriber, there's no need to do anything. But given there was confusion in customers and we don't want to disappoint anybody, I thought I would pause the podcast and give this public service announcement. I hope everything was clear. We'll be repeating this in the next couple of Multipolarity briefs so that it is. Thanks so much for listening. Teaser trailer.
Bad night for Fidesz on Sunday. They lost in a landslide to the new Tisza party headed by Péter Magyar, the new prime minister, I guess, prime minister-elect of Hungary. People will know that I got the election wrong, so it was pretty good. But, I mean, the reason for it is just the polls. The polls diverged. The opposition and the Fidesz polls diverged completely, gave completely different readings. And so one set had to be fake. There was no statistical error between them. And I thought that the Tisza ones were kind of crazy. I thought a supermajority for the opposition was, almost impossible. But apparently not. So the Tisza polls were correct, and the government polls were fake, I guess. I mean, they must be push polls. It was greeted with surprise here in Hungary because in Hungary people do pay attention to the government polls. And in the international sphere, people thought it was just a shoe-in because they just only saw the Tisza polls. So there was a little bit of an information vacuum going on there. Anyway, Fidesz lost in a landslide to Péter Magyar's party. And there are lots of, hot takes going around the internet. As I said before the show, people like reading things into elections. Elections are actually just changes of power. That's all they are. They're done by ballot boxes rather than with guns. That's really all they are. Usually they're determined by relatively simple variables, unless you have a very homogeneous economic cycle. Maybe in the 1960s or something like that, there was a more ideological component to elections. But for a very long time, elections can be largely explained by the economy in many countries. And that's basically what happened in Hungary. The cost of living shock here was extremely bad during the inflation from the pandemic and the Ukraine war. It was worse. I'm not saying it was worse, but it was worse for staples and so on, like food prices. It was less bad for energy, actually, than in Western Europe. And most governments that presided over that cost of living increase have not survived. And Fidesz got eaten too. Now, why did anyone think it would be different? Because Fidesz were communicating to people that the fault was the war. And it seemed that people understood that, but I think at the end of the day, people just vote with their pocketbooks. There was fatigue with the party, of course, as well. It was in power for 16 years. But I think it was really the cost of living crisis. Everybody in Hungary knows that there was the before the wartime and after the wartime. Anyway, those are the basic electoral dynamics. I don't think, they're super interesting, but for what it's worth. But really now, I think what people are going to come to see, or they should have seen, especially we're recording on Tuesday, especially on Monday and today, is that this election wasn't really about Hungary. The amount of hype that it got in the international press wasn't really about Hungary. And it wasn't really about political ideology or post-liberalism or whatever takes they're giving on Twitter. It was about the EU. The Tisza party were enormously backed by Brussels. And many of the people in the party are Brussels adjacent. They've worked for think tanks. I think some of them have actually worked in the commission and so on. They're Eurocrat types. Magyar himself is not, as many people probably know. He's a defector from Tisza. He used to be married to the former Minister of Justice. Strange stories on that if you want to look into it. But the dominant base of the Tisza party are basically Eurocrats. What the Europeans have done in backing the Tisza party and being so aggressive against the Orbán government and so on. To be clear, I do not think they swung the election. It was due to cost of living standards, but they put a lot of effort in to make sure that Tisza won. And there was even concern here that if Tisza lost, there'd be protests and so on. And there was evidence that that was going to happen. So why did they go all in? Well, basically, they saw Viktor Orbán as the biggest roadblock in the way of creating a European superstate, in effect. And Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech after the Hungarian election. I think it was on Monday. And I joked to a friend of mine that you'd almost think she'd won the election. It was a remarkable speech. You'd almost think she won the election by the way she was talking. And maybe in some sense she had. And she basically said, a couple of things about Hungary and so on. And then she said, this is a great opportunity to get rid of to bring in qualified majority voting. And what that would mean is small countries would lose all their power of veto and so on. And of course, this has been because Orbán in Hungary has been using the veto. This would be an enormous step. Now, she qualified that by saying, for matters of foreign policy. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The point about this statement isn't about whether, now that Orbán's gone, they will get qualified majority voting. They may not. It may take a long time. It will probably take a long time to get there. And I think a Wall Street Journal article a Wall Street journalist on Twitter was saying, this won't end, and that. It's not about that. It's about the intention. You see, when you come out and you say, we need to go to qualified majority voting, you're sort of saying we need to go full nuclear, right? Like, there are many steps between here and going to qualified majority voting in the EU. And von der Leyen is so pumped up by the Hungarian election, and not wrongly, I'm not saying she's wrong on this, that she'll lead with such a big punch, rather than, talking about a more centralized budget or something like that, which will be the first step to this. She goes right for the jugular and talks about qualified majority voting. So that's the plan here. They want to go turbo-federalist. And that brings us back to the foreign point. We need qualified majority voting on matters of foreign policy. The EU has seen this war as an enormous opportunity to create a federal state in Europe. In Hungary, the Orbán government often said that Europe was turning from an economic union into a war union. And it is. It's an accurate assessment of what's going on. It's going to destroy itself in the process, of course, but it is. And what it's doing is it's using the defense issue to batter down objections to previous federalist impulses. So, as late as 10 years ago or so, to say that you should have a massive, big centralized budget and joint borrowing in Brussels, that had real opposition in countries like Germany and the Netherlands and so on. Not for some of it ideological reason, but some of it just straightforward political, and most of it, I think, actually relatively sensible in retrospect. If you come in and you say, if you don't give us this centralized borrowing, Russia's going to invade Europe, it's very hard to stand against that anymore. And they found that this battering ram has been enormously successful. It started with COVID. It actually started with COVID. But COVID was only a temporary crisis. Now they have this perceived permanent crisis with Russia. Perceived, I'll say, permanent crisis. And what they're doing is they're using it to really speed up the process of federalization. Now, at the same time, Europe's falling apart. I mean, it really is falling apart. We've talked about it on the show multiple times, deindustrializing and so on. And as you just said in the first segment of this show, Andrew, the energy, food crisis, poly crisis, whatever you want to call it, that's coming is going to be brutal. It's going to bankrupt a bunch of European countries very quickly, looking at you, France, looking at you, Italy. It's going to lead to really crazy stuff. But the point is, they see this as their opportunity. And the issue with Orbán isn't just that he's a vote. Robert Fico is also a vote against this, although the rumors in Budapest now is that Fico can't really stand alone. But there's elections coming up in Poland and so on next year. There's also Babic in Czechia. But the general feeling is that it'll be very hard for these guys to stand up, because the Orbán government gave the clearest explanation of the politics of this. They kept hammering it into people's heads. I think listeners need to understand, if they've never worked around politics before, that an awful lot of politicians aren't actually that good at politics. Political strategy. So let me give you an example. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's running as the law and justice candidate for Poland next year, I think, in the elections. And he's a conservative Polish nationalist. If you read his Wikipedia page, you'll think he'll be the boogeyman of Europe. He doesn't like LGBT, etc., etc. This guy actually almost reads, if you read his Wikipedia page, quote unquote, worse than Orbán from a Brussels point of view. But then you keep reading and you realize that he's really hawkish on Russia. Really hawkish on Russia. Now, he's opposed to collective EU defense. He just wants a bigger Polish army and everything like that. But he's really hawkish on Russia. With people like that, you can get a hook in. If you're these clever operators in Brussels, you can maneuver them. Even if they're smart, you can maneuver them into a position where, let's say that their top priority is expanding the Polish military because you're scared of the Russians coming. And you box them into a situation where they can only vote in a binary. Either they expand the army or they don't expand the army. But to expand the army, they have to sign on to some federalist nonsense that they really don't want to do. And that's the game in Europe. And the Orbán government just understood it. It was in power for 16 years. It had got really good at Brussels politics. And it could kind of tell people, what was going on. That's why they painted such a target on Orbán. And that's what's not being understood in these debates about post-liberalism or authoritarianism versus non-authoritarianism, or even opposition to the Ukraine war itself. All these narratives online are completely misleading. The primary issue for the Europeans in this election was the expansion of Europe itself. And they've put a guy in who's you're not going to hear of Peter Magyar in about 2 weeks. He's going to disappear. The EU's going to play all its tricks on the guy, and they're going to get him to sign along the dotted line. If they don't, they'll palace coup him and they'll put one of their bureaucrats in power. And that's all they care about. And, you might, if you follow it closely, see the Budapest conservative ecosystem get torn apart. That's just red meat for the base. What they're really going for is this federalist expansion. And even if these countries like Poland vote in a populist, or France, there are ways of squeezing these people. With France, it's the budget. It's say, oh yes, keep going, keep voting against us, and we'll send your borrowing costs to the moon. With Poland, the way to wind them up is Russia, right? There's all tricks with these guys. The only one that really had a firm boots on the ground, couldn't touch the guy, was Viktor Orbán, and he's gone. So 4 years now, the Europeans have to really turbocharge the federalist project at the same time as Europe collapses. And many of the federalist so-called reforms are bonkers. And the last thing I'd say is, I don't want to sound polemical, but Brussels has increasingly become a corrupt grift hub. Everybody knows it. You can go there and you can see it. You see it in the streets. You get the vibe there. It's become really, really corrupt. So the federalism has passed the point of being an ideal. It still is an ideal for many of these guys. Mario Draghi is a true dyed-in-the-wool federalist. He really believes in it. But for every Mario Draghi, there's somebody that's just trying to get it at the tea, And it's a really desperate situation. Bad times ahead for Europe.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that, we're quite happy to pat ourselves on the back when we get things right, but when we get our predictions wrong, we're I think we should be open about it. We didn't think that Tisza would win the election, and they did, and they won it resoundingly, I would say. From somebody who doesn't live in Budapest or in Hungary at all and is looking from the outside, it seems to me a classic case of two things. The first is that it's the economy, stupid, right? It's like the classic thing that the economy and how well off people feel is usually the key matter, the key issue in any given election. It's seldom that elections are run beyond that. But the second point is that 16 years in power is enough. Like, people tend to get a little bit tired themselves. They get stuck in their ways. They start making errors. They become overconfident. Corruption can set in, soft or otherwise. And people also start to get tired of them. It's like in football. It's very rare that a manager in football has a shelf life beyond 6 seasons or so. It's very rare. But I think beyond that, you're absolutely right, Philip. The key issue here is European integration and the ability of Central Europe to impose its will on individual nations regarding discrete issues. And it's long been known that Europe has this kind of integration through crisis tendency and preference. I mean, like Jean-Claude Monnet, the founder, if anybody was the founding father of the European Union, it's Jean-Claude Monnet. And he said in his memoirs that Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises, right? That was Jean-Claude Monnet's phrase. Like, he understood how it would work. And, in the last 10 years or so, they responded to the Eurozone debt crisis, the sovereign debt crisis involving Greece and Italy and a few other countries, by gathering more power. There was a lot of transfer of fiscal power and economic governance to the European Union. You had like the EU stability, the European Stability Mechanism. You had the fiscal compact. I mean, these are very powerful tools to put in Brussels' hands. The response to the migration crisis was to strengthen Frontex into the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, which, quite significantly expanded EU powers over things like asylum policy and borders. The response to the pandemic in 2021 was to give the EU more competencies in national healthcare and fiscal policies. And it gave them a massive kind of slush fund called Next Generation EU. So, whenever there's a crisis, they respond in this way by handing more power and more competencies that used to be in the hands of individual nation states to the EUcrats, as they're sometimes called. And you get people like Angela Merkel saying the solution is more Europe, not less of it. Whenever there's a crisis, you'll hear one of these guys, it might be Merz, it might be von der Leyen, saying, the solution to our problems in Ukraine is more Europe, not less of it. It's more integration, it's more unity, right? This is how they react. And now Orbán's gone. I mean, Hungary will just be walked over. I watched this during Brexit, where I watched a series of negotiating teams that were way out of their depth just have rings run around them by Michel Barnier and the EU negotiating team. It was shameful from a British point of view how incompetent the British negotiating team was compared with their European equivalent. You might think that Eurocrats, these kind of EU bureaucrat sorts, these apparatchik sorts who populate the EU, are incompetent when it comes to politics and actually running things competently and all the rest of it. But what they're really good at, what they're really exceptional at, is using rules and regulations and using the pressure points that they hold over their opponents to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until you finally are crushed like a python. They're really fantastic at that. And like a python, once they've got themselves wrapped around you, they just keep squeezing until you're completely out of breath. And what's going to happen with Magyar is, because he's inexperienced, They'll give him a few easy wins so he can bolster his cred. But on the really crucial issues, they'll insist, and and even if he doesn't just give in, and I suspect from afar again, I suspect all his it's Orbanism without the corruption stuff is just shtick to get in. Because, you see a lot of these street interviews with Hungarians and they're saying, no, we don't want more migration. We don't want to give money to Ukraine. We don't, we're against the war. No, of course we want to keep buying Russian gas because it's so much cheaper and we don't want to pay more for our electricity. It's just we want better relations with the EU and we want less corruption. Well, yeah, sure, you can deal with the corruption, but you can't have better relations with the EU without buying, without ending the purchase of Russian gas, without taking more immigrants. You can't have all of those things because the very fact that Orbán broke off with the EU or had conflict with the European Union was because he refused to take migrants. It was because he refused to give up cheap Russian gas. It was because he wouldn't allow the Hungarian judiciary to be stacked with pro-European liberal progressive judges who would just strike down any legislation that he tried to pass. These were the reasons that he had the conflict in the first place. So to heal relations with the EU, you're going to have to get rid of those conflicts. And that's what the EU will do, though. They might not do it straight away, but every single win that they take will be a win designed to make it harder to resist them in the future. And honestly, they can do so much damage within 4 years. They can just wrap themselves around Magyar like a python and just keep squeezing, right? Like every time he breathes in, right? Every time he breathes out, they'll just squeeze a little bit harder, right? That's how it works, and they're extremely good at it. And they'll try to fix the table so that somebody like Orbán can never stop them in future. And in fact, they'll try and fix it so that somebody like Orbán can never be elected in Hungary ever again. That's what they'll try and do. Whether it'll work out on a domestic level, I don't know. We've already talked about a huge economic crisis that is going to hit Europe. Hungary will not be spared from that, especially if Magyar cannot maintain very good relations with Russia and the Trump administration. So who knows what happens but in Hungary. But that's what the EU is going to try and do, basically, Philip, is they're going to try and run rings around Magyar. They're going to try to fix it so that somebody like him can never derail what Ursula von der Leyen wants ever again. They can never stand in his way again. And they're going to try and fix it so that somebody like Orbán can never be elected in Hungary again. They don't want to have to go through this again. They don't want to have to cancel elections like they did in Romania. So they're going to try and, tilt the table permanently.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much an accurate summary. I don't know if they'll even give him easy wins. Magyar came out and said, kind of gave an inaugural speech where he pretty much kind of said, I'm going to stick to the Fidesz style policies and so on. As you say, they conflict with the European Union. And the European Union responded by leaking, quote unquote, handing off to their stenographers at the Financial Times a list of what the Hungarian government's going to have to do to get back into the good graces of the EU. It's just a list of demands, It's just a list of demands. I think they know that Magyar may come from the more conservative side of the Hungarian political aisle, and I think he does kind of believe in it. I don't think he's temperamentally a liberal. He was kind of married to the previous justice minister, who is definitely a conservative, but he surrounded himself. It's what I said. The party itself is made up of the Eurocrat, pro-European class, and it's just not hard to bounce out a prime minister if he starts misbehaving. I mean, they'll do the pressure thing, of course, first, as you said. They'll pressure point. For example, he needs to get access to the European funds, and he needs to get this fine off the country, $1 million a day, I think, for the migration previously. He needs to get those over the line to show that he's making progress with the EU. And they'll probably pressure him on them. But if he becomes an upstart, I think they'll just palace coup him. I don't think it will be that hard, to be honest. With his cabinet, he'll realise at some point that the cabinet are more loyal to Brussels than they are to him. Can they permanently turn Hungary? I don't know. I don't think so. It's not Romania. A supermajority can do a lot. Hungarians like their supermajorities. People should recognize that. The talking point that the Orbán government was autocratic or something, what they're really saying is they had supermajorities, like I think 3 times in a row, or twice. I think it was twice, and then a large majority the other time. Hungarians just like electing supermajorities. They like an authoritative government. And I don't think that's actually a bad thing. And they've given Tisza this supermajority now too. So they'll get a lot done domestically. I think Brussels is slightly deluding themselves that if they can just take down the kind of conservative networks that Fidesz has built over time, that'll fundamentally, as you say, stop Fidesz from getting elected again. This goes back to what I said at the beginning. People project things onto elections that aren't real. It's just a changing of power. Elections are very mechanical processes. And Magyar has been dealt a very bad deck. He's going into a major energy crisis that we've just been talking about. His government has no experience, absolutely zero experience. I think some of them have been in the commission before, but that's a completely different thing from national government. And they have to carry out Fidesz purges of all the ministries. So because Fidesz have been in power for 16 years, they can point in any direction to a relatively senior official in a government ministry and say that person's too Fidesz aligned, and they will. But that person may be Fidesz aligned, but it's also the person with the knowledge of how to run the ministry. So they're going to be managing an energy crisis really from day one, or a week into their government or something like that, while trying to engage in a massive purge of 16 years of built-up government, and also picking this, trying to do negotiations with the EU. I mean, Hungarians are. I don't think this government's going to last too long in the eyes of the population, but it's got a supermajority, so it's not going anywhere. So that's kind of the situation. It's going to be a very interesting time for Hungary. But more broadly than that, I think, because let's be real, I think most people aren't that interested in Hungarian domestic politics. We just need to focus front and center on this European Union issue. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the new Hungarian government's here for 4 years and gone after that, which is probably the case in my opinion, and no other firm candidate gets in place. So, for example, even if the Polish Conservatives get in, they twist his arm on defence. Even if Marine Le Pen gets in, or Bardella, or whoever's running, they twist their arm on the fiscal situation, like they've done with Maloney in Italy. How much can they do with 4 years of just, open terrain to work with in the EU? With this, by the way, with this level of aggression to get federalism done, von der Leyen is the most aggressive person to get this done. And she has this kind of dictatorial, almost authoritarian style, and her commissioners are kind of like a mafia or whatever. This is the perfect set of people, in a way, or person, to get this done. And the crisis that they have is ongoing and quote-unquote existential, the Russia supposed crisis, that, it's enough to scare the horses and to terrify everyone out of it. It's the best shot. It's the best run they'll ever have this next 4 years. And how far can they go with it? I'd only encourage people to look into some of the reforms that they want to put in place. I'm not talking about qualified majority voting. I think they'll have to salami slice that. I think they know how to do this very well. They know how to introduce this part of the component of the superstate, then this part, and then later on down the line, introduce a little bit of qualified majority voting for security issues, and then expand the definition of security issues to include economic issues, or whatever way they do it. They're very good at this. But even the stuff that comes before, basically shutting down democracy, which is what qualified majority voting will be. I mean, in any meaningful sense, it'll just be the bigger countries then running the smaller countries. I mean, running at a pretty granular level. Like if you're a smaller country in that situation, you won't have much to do in your actual government, and you'll probably actually get all your jobs and your assets and everything stripped as the larger countries just vote to, take them from you through regulations or whatever they choose to use, like harmonizing corporation tax, and plenty of ways to get that done. But, even before you get to the kind of nightmare nuclear scenario where they remove effectively democracy and turn it into a dictatorial superstate, which is where it's going, even some of these introductions of joint borrowing and so on, even the EU 2028, 2034, I think it is, budget, you want to go and look into some of the details about this. I mean, I'll just say, I don't advertise on the podcast too much what I'm actually doing in Hungary, but I suppose now that the Fidesz government is gone, it doesn't matter. Most of my work, if you go and look on the institute that I was working for, is on these issues. I was looking at what their budget was, how they were putting it together, whether it added up, and so on. This stuff is bonkers. And the really, really interesting thing that I learned from working in the International Affairs Institute here is one of the ways that the Europeans get away with this is that they control the information system completely. So, for example, on the 2028-2034 budget, this is a massively expanded budget. I won't go into all the details of it, but it drastically expands the taxing and spending power of Brussels in ways that make no sense, in ways that are genuinely dangerous. Just to give one example, they take cigarette excise taxes away from the nation state and they put them into Brussels. Cigarette excise taxes are there to pay for lung cancer treatment for smokers. I mean, really bonkers stuff that they're doing in these packages. And when you go to research them, which I have done professionally for 2 years now, when you go to research them, you realize that the only research that's produced on these sorts of things comes from Brussels-based think tanks. All of them funded centrally from the European Commission. And so even the act of putting out a 10-page pamphlet, a critical overview, and trust me, these policies are not hard to criticize because they're usually bonkers and they make no economic sense. But even putting out a 10-page report on the budget, why it might not work, why it's a bad idea, what a better one would look like, it's kind of a minor act of rebellion in the EU. They don't want that being said. They don't want those documents floating around out there. They want complete control over the way that the policies are designed and so on, and basically no public debate in the national countries. The future of the EU, if it keeps moving in this direction, is basically EU think tanks producing these so-called white papers or whatever they call them, sending them to the capitals of every European city and saying, this is what your government's going to do. Can we debate them? No, you can't. Implement them. And that's kind of where we're moving. And we're moving to that point at the same time as, number one, these crises are getting worse and worse. Number two, there's massive fiscal pressures building up in the European Union. And by the way, issuing collective debt, it's just issuing more debt on top of the already enormous national debt burdens and then imposing more taxes on the nation states. So all this is taking place against the backdrop of this move to a kind of a dictatorial superstate. And what's going to happen? Are we going to get to the point of like complete like hellish borderline Soviet Union style dictator bureaucrat superstate? No, probably not. The whole thing's probably going to collapse. They're pushing this way too far, way too fast. Am I saying it's going to collapse in 4 years? No, not really, unless like this food and energy crisis just tears the whole continent apart, which it might, by the way. But it's just going to collapse in some way or other. And I'd say, if they keep pushing in this direction, and now that the Orbán government's out of the way, I wouldn't be surprised if they collapse this thing within a decade.